Hello and welcome to A Squirrel Plays. It's me, the Squirrel, and today's topic is the current state of the video game industry. We'll be taking a little break from Dungeons & Dragons for now and jumping back into video game land. However, before we get that started, I would like to announce that this video is sponsored by... nobody. I'm just kidding. What I really wanted to say is that we started a Discord server. It's super small and empty at the moment as things are just getting started, but it is there and I'd love for you to be a part of it and help it grow. There will be a link in the description, and if my little squirrel brain can remember, I'll make a comment and pin it. I would also like to once again thank each and every one of you, whether you're just viewing the video or you're commenting, subscribing, liking, all that good stuff. I want you to know that I am very grateful for that. This channel has grown way past what I expected it to, and it has been absolutely wild to see it unfold. The people I've gotten to interact with seem to be on board with making ourselves a nice little community here, and I hope that attitude continues so we can keep reaching out to others. So far, it's been an awful lot of fun, and I've been very surprised with all the positivity and support that I've gotten. But let me stop right there before I get sappy and get on with this video. So, the current state of the industry. Well, that's kind of a big topic, isn't it? Truth be told, I did have a lot of trouble writing out my thoughts for this one. It's a topic that comes up a lot for me and something I do enjoy talking about, even if the discussion is usually a bit depressing due to things being the way they currently are. However, I would like to clarify that this is not going to be me ranting and raving and pretending to be mad at everything, because that's what gets the clicks on YouTube. If you want to listen to a grown adult pretend to be mad about everything and act like a child, then, well, I guess you can go watch somebody like Angry Joe. But as for me and my little community here, I try to be a little bit more positive and look at things in a constructive way. The hard part about it, though, is that there are so many moving parts and things to talk about that it's hard to make a single video on it without it being longer than the director's cut of Lord of the Rings. So I think what I'm going to do is I'm just going to focus on one thing at a time in each video and see how it goes. Another interesting note is that I got fairly deep into writing this script before the channel had another growth spurt. A lot of you probably already know this, but I discovered that you can get a lot of data from YouTube about your audience. Things like view times, click-through rates, impressions, all that good stuff. One interesting piece of information I get, though, is an age range. Turns out a fair share of my audience is on the younger side, which is not at all a problem. As a matter of fact, it's probably a good thing. But the tricky part was I had to take my script from a different approach now. I didn't have to dumb down anything because I felt like you young whippersnappers wouldn't understand anything. I just had to approach it from a different point of view. For example, paid cosmetics in video games and other assorted microtransactions. A fair chunk of my audience grew up with those things. That's the norm for them. A game without that would be strange. It'd be different and unusual. For me, despite video games doing just that for several years now, it's still incredibly tacky and off-putting for me to see that in a video game. I get pretty irked when I'm sitting at the main menu of a game and there's a store or shop button on the screen. It takes me right out of it and ruins the mood. And that's because I grew up with games that didn't do that. If you had made a game like that during the time of my upbringing, you would have been ripped to shreds and laughed out of existence.
To shreds, you say?
The idea was unheard of and nonsensical. There were companies that tried to milk a little extra money out of gamers, and they were left to wither and fade. And that's the audience I originally wrote a script for, but now that I know who I'm mostly talking to, I need to take a different approach. I need to make sure nobody gets left behind in the conversation so that everyone can participate. Also, I think what I may do is make this topic a small series since there's multiple things to talk about. That can give other talking points more room to breathe instead of being all crammed into a single video. And since I have said all that, let's take the time in this video to talk about the giant shift that took place in the industry. The reason I'd like to start with the shift is that I want to clarify that the past isn't all beer and Skittles.
The cop's life isn't all beer and Skittles,
I've seen more than a handful of younger people go on and on about how back in the day, companies used to care about their games. More love and care was put into the creations, there was better quality control, and things were just all better all around. Well, I got news for you. When it comes to video games, the past looks better because you're only looking at the games that survived. I'm about as old as the NES, and I still have the one my parents bought back in the 80s when they came out. Me and my brother grew up with that system, as well as the SNES and the Nintendo 64 when it came out. We were a Nintendo family through and through, and let me tell you, there were some absolute stinkers made for those consoles. But more importantly, before me or the NES were made, there was the Atari era. And that's where things get interesting. In favor of trying to keep the video short, I won't go into full detail, but if you'd like to do a little research on your own, feel free to look up the video game crash of 1983. Long story short, people got greedy and the whole thing came crashing down on top of them. Companies absolutely flooded the market, quality control took a nosedive as it tends to do, and things went from bad to worse, giving us gems like E.T. Oh Lord. Another issue they faced at the time was the introduction of the home computer, a competitor that they were entirely unprepared for. Now, if you've already been skimming articles while listening to this, you might have seen that Nintendo released the NES in America around 1985 to 1986. You might be thinking, well, wait a minute, you strangely handsome squirrel, why in the world would they release their console right after that market crash? Well, the NES was in development when Atari was crushing it in sales before ultimately destroying the market. Because the NES was released right alongside that big crash, Nintendo decided to do things a little bit differently. As I mentioned before, excuse me, choking on my spit. As I mentioned before, quality took a nosedive during the Atari era. Third-party developers were completely out of control and they were churning out whatever they felt like. Because of this, Nintendo put a chokehold on quality and made sure things were done to a very specific degree, causing a change in the direction of what was known about video game development at that time. Some of you might be familiar with this little sticker. This was Nintendo's official seal of quality. Once upon a time, games developed for the Nintendo Entertainment System had to be approved by Nintendo. This meant they were not only tested for quality and performance, but also the quality of the content. Nintendo wasn't about to let just any old thing be put on their system. They had standards, believe it or not. Unfortunately, there were still those out there that sought to make a quick buck and bypass the approval process altogether. You may have seen some NES games that were made on a black cartridge. Odds are that game wasn't licensed by Nintendo and was technically illegal, though still somehow sold in stores. The cartridges were actually a risk to your console because of the way they bypassed the startup process when you powered it on. Miraculously, despite having a few of these as a child and playing them rather frequently, my NES still lives and breathes to this day. And this, ladies and gents, is where people make the mistake of romanticizing the past. You see, it's really easy to romanticize what you don't know when you're only given a single part of it. It's no wonder people can take this little piece of knowledge and continue on thinking the past was just a better place as far as video games were concerned. But as we just learned only a few years prior to Nintendo's first console, the entire game industry went so clearly the past isn't all it's cracked up to be. And just to rain on your parade a little more, as someone who lived through Nintendo's beginnings, I can assure you that this fancy seal of quality didn't take long to become nothing more than a simple sticker that got slapped on a box. Sadly, before the Super Nintendo ever had a chance to hit the shelves, the golden Nintendo seal of quality sticker lost its meaning and value. Why? Well, probably because there was money to be made, but that's just my speculation. However, Nintendo did keep the games they made themselves to a much higher degree of quality, and they did so for many years. Technically, they still do, with Metroid Dread being a fantastic example, but they have since dipped into modern practices, and we'll talk about that when we get there. And by now, you're probably wondering where exactly is this big shift that I mentioned at the beginning of the video. Was the shift when Nintendo took a crash market and flipped it upside down? Well, no. The shift I'm referring to actually comes later, so let me speed run through the history a little bit. In the 90s, we were blessed with the Super Nintendo Entertainment System, which I'd argue had some of the best games ever created, as well as some of the greatest musical compositions my ears have ever heard. For the most part, companies learned that if they wanted to make money by making video games, they needed to make a quality game. It wasn't because it was their passion or they poured their hearts and souls into it and all that good stuff. No, that was just the way that was proven to make money at the time. Quality is a valuable thing, and it's been that way since the dawn of time. However, the investors weren't quite convinced. Atari's market crash wasn't exactly that far behind, so Nintendo and friends were still fighting an uphill battle. It didn't help that other consoles trying to compete with Nintendo weren't doing so hot. Now, I could be wrong, but I believe it was somewhere during the second half of the Nintendo 64's reign that investors started to realize video games were here to stay. Because of that, money got involved.
Buckets of it.
And that's where the big shift happened. Studios were getting bought up left and right. Squaresoft had turned into Square Enix and was swelling up like a balloon. Microsoft bought Rare and killed off one of the best game studios that ever existed. Activision was well on its way to success, and Blizzard was off doing its own thing. The race was on. Investors had been brought into the mix, and the roll downhill began. Now, just as a side note, I'm going to give you a little life lesson here. It might sound like I'm just some grumpy old salty squirrel, but there is truth in what I say. No matter what company you work for, no matter who runs it, and no matter what they tell you, the investors are the one making the decisions. And believe me when I say, the only thing investors care about is making their money. They don't care about the company, they don't care about the product, and they certainly don't care about you. So long as they get a return on their investment, the company could die tomorrow and 3,000 people could be unemployed and they wouldn't bat an eye. Unfortunately, that's just how American business works. But where does that put us? Well, my friends, we are currently living in what seems to be an infinite period of 1983 all over again. These Titan game companies have completely flooded the market. There's just one key difference between now and then. These companies are too big to fail. All the little companies that normally would have died off during a flooded market were consumed over the years, giving us things like Square Enix, Activision Blizzard, and whatever Microsoft has going on. And do you remember what else happened in 1983? The quality took a nosedive. It went straight down into the ground. We see that every day in the current video game industry. We saw back in the 80s and 90s that if you wanted to make money making video games, you had to make a fairly decent product. Since then, we have learned that you don't have to make a good product. You don't even have to make a full product anymore. You can actually charge people to play your game in an unfinished state. Not only do you get the benefit of being paid before your work is even done, you get the additional benefit of all the playtesting information your players provide. Quality control, bug testing, feedback, the community, all that is now in the hands of paying customers. So not only do they pay you before your job is done, they help you do your job for you. It's insane. On top of that, we've learned that you can chop up a game and sell it in pieces disguised as additional content. We've learned that you can publish a game and keep getting paid to just basically mod it. I'm looking at you, Nintendo, with your $6 DLC characters for Smash. We've learned you can sell season passes, battle passes, in-game currencies, and loot boxes that may or may not give you something you need. But probably what is the most offensive of all is we have learned how to exploit dopamine. This took us from the old theory of, if I want to make money making video games, then I need to produce a quality game so people will want to buy it, to the new theory, I just need to make people think they're having a good time. Now, I won't get off into the weeds of dopamine because I'm not a doctor and I'm certainly not trying to pose as one. The only thing I want to tell you is that dopamine is one hell of a drug, and I highly encourage you to learn more about it and get it under control. Just please learn from a reputable source and not some random YouTuber. Now, feel free to correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe the dopamine trick was discovered right around the time Facebook started becoming a thing along with mobile gaming. Those two discovered it and exploited the ever-living daylights out of it. They proved how insanely profitable it could be, and this mindset has since bled over into the rest of the video game industry. That's how we ended up with loot boxes. Again, why bother making a decent quality game when you can instead just get somebody addicted to it? And it's about this point that I start to wander really far off base and get into the thick of things. I could go on and on and on about DLCs, post 1.0 updates and game changes, day one patches, loot boxes, gambling, and many other things, but I think I've spoken enough for today. I'll also admit that this video has been overwhelmingly negative, but there are some things in history that you can't quite paint in a positive light. There is such a thing as toxic positivity. Nintendo absolutely started off on the right foot with the NES, but they chose not to stay the course. Some steps were quicker than others, but to be completely fair, it did take them an awful long time to give in to the DLC gig. Thankfully, they don't believe in early access as of recording this. Now, I'd love to dig further into specific concepts, especially games updating and changing things after their 1.0 release, because that's really been burning my fur lately. But I'll have to tackle that in another video. For this one, I wanted to talk about where we've been, where we were, and where we currently are. Sadly, I don't think we're in a very good spot. Thankfully, despite titans such as Activision Blizzard trying to dominate the market is more accessible than it ever has been. This allows any and all developers to take a stab at it with their own creations. Unfortunately, that also comes with its downsides. But what can we take away from all of this? What is the good news? The good news is, we saw that focusing on quality gave us some of the classics that the world won't soon forget. Because of this, we know it was once possible to survive making quality games. And here's the best part. There are still some people out there doing just that. Every so often, there's a single person or a group out there that decides they want to make a good game. Some do it for fun, some do it just because, some are merely experimenting, and some do it just simply because they want to make a good video game and get paid for it, which is perfectly fine by me. We've seen single individuals do so well that companies try to mimic their work for years to come. Just have a look at Minecraft and Stardew Valley and the endless sea of clones that have tried to replicate their success. There's more than a handful of games out there that were made by just a single person that brought more to the table than any AAA studio ever has. Shoot, Tetris was made by a single person. My point is, those quality games are still out there, arguably in the same quantity. The problem is, you just have so much more garbage these days to swim through before you can actually find that game. But what do you think? Am I just a grumpy old squirrel? Do you enjoy the 58th entry of Call of Duty and generic Battle Royale number 37? Or maybe you got some hidden gems you'd like to share. By all means, let me know where you stand and where you think the industry is headed. Will it collapse and we'll have to start all over? Are we stuck here forever? Did this video even make a point? Who knows?
Find out next time on Dragon Balls.